Order, order. Welcome to this morning's evidence session. This is the final evidence session of our inquiry into buses connecting communities. We'll be putting questions to the Minister on the effectiveness of government efforts to improve bus connectivity in non-urban areas of England. We'll be exploring various topics including funding, reforms to local powers and support for alternative service models such as community transport and demand responsive transport. Could I ask you both to introduce yourselves, please, starting with Minister?
Good morning, my name is Simon Lightwood and I'm the Minister for Local Transport.
Good morning, I'm Stephen Fidler and I'm Director for Buses and Inclusion at DFT.
Welcome. So, Minister, the Department stated in your written evidence to the committee that bus services are, I quote, not delivering for passengers across England, unquote. What, in your view, are the reasons for this?
Well, first of all, I think good local bus services are a really important, an essential part of a prosperous and sustainable community. And they will play, I think, a really crucial role in delivering the government's missions, including on economic growth. But they haven't, as you said there, Chair, they haven't been delivering across the country. I think we inherited a really difficult situation where bus journeys had been in decline for a number of years. I think something like 300 million fewer bus journeys between 2010 and 2024. And I think the sector faces four key challenges. That would be reduced passenger numbers following on from the pandemic. I think we're up to something like 90% of fare-paying passengers have returned to the network, but only 75% of concessionary have returned to the network. Higher costs in terms of wages and also fuel costs, and also just recognising the lower levels of local transport authority support and their ability to fund those services that are classed at times as not commercially viable. And of course, increased congestion. That also plays a really important role there because that ultimately slows down our bus services, makes them less reliable, and then that erodes trust. And so people then don't use the bus, they go to their cars, and you end up with this vicious cycle, if you like, of decline. Overall, though, all those factors put together have resulted in what I see as a significant decline in trust. Trust by passengers. Trust that the buses are going to turn up, they're going to get them to the place that they need to be, they're going to be accessible, they're going to be frequent, and I think that's our fundamental challenge going forward. Of course, coming into government, we haven't wasted any time in getting stuck in on this issue with our ambition to grow bus services. Obviously, we legislated, I think it's back in September, to expand the ability for all local transport authorities to explore franchising. We also published revised guidance on franchising to all local transport authorities in England. And we introduced, of course, very excitingly, the Bus Services Bill, which is now entering the House of Commons. And we started to reform how bus services are funded. Local transport authorities say to me all the time they need greater certainty when it comes to funding. There's been lots of cliff edge funding in the past. And so we're looking to outline how we fund day-to-day spending plans over the next 3 years and then capital investment plans over 4 years. And I think we've already shown our commitment to reforming funding. The 25-26 funding that went to local authorities combined both the BSIP and the local authority BSOG element into one bus grant. So we've already made significant steps, but the challenges are very real.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a very full response, and our questions are going to cover the issues that you did bring up. But I just want to touch on where you started with the growth mission, the government's growth mission. Evidence we've heard in our inquiry suggests that out-of-town areas have suffered the biggest decline to their bus services. Yeah. So what works for Manchester may not work for Norfolk. So how will the government's implementation of its missions benefit bus provision in the underserved areas?
I think it's important that we recognise that there is no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to fixing our buses. That's why we've introduced the Bus Services Bill. That's designed to give local leaders the tools that they need and the flexibility that they need to put those interventions in place. And I believe firmly, I think this government believes firmly, that it's local leaders that should be empowered to make those interventions. It shouldn't be dictated by national government, somebody sitting in Westminster or Whitehall. It should be local leaders who really understand their community. They understand the social and economic challenges within those communities. Our job is to empower them with the tools and indeed the funding to tackle that. And that's exactly what the bill entails, not only through franchising and the various models that entails, lifting the ban on what used to be called municipal but local authority operated bus companies, and also further strengthening the work of enhanced partnerships. And we have a support programme that we've continued to work on. We have something called the Bus Centre of Excellence, and we'll be holding, actually, for members' information, we're holding a session conference on quality rural bus services in July, and Chair, you will of course be getting an invitation to attend that, and that will explore our plans and how that can particularly benefit rural areas.
Okay, I think we will be probing on the distinction and the capacity and capability of the different types of local authority areas. So we'll go on, Steph.
Thank you. Minister, it's good to hear about the importance of empowerment of local leaders, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have the ambition that you sound like you have for this. And certainly when this committee sought to find a place to visit to catch a bus, let alone talk about buses, we had to go to Ireland, and we were actually very impressed by their level of ambition, particularly the government's ambition to plug gaps in the network and increase service frequency, which is actually quite often forgotten about when we talk about bus improvement. If people can get a bus where they want to go at the time they want to go, they're more likely to use it. And all the other problems that you've alluded to go away when there is actually increased demand for services. So I guess I wanted to ask you specifically on that ambition. Do you have similar ambitions to our colleagues in the Republic of Ireland, and or do you plan to leave that part up to local authorities too?
So I think Ireland's approach is really interesting. They're tackling similar issues to us when it comes to particularly the challenges in our suburban and towns. That being said, obviously, you can't directly transfer their experience, I think, to England necessarily. The geographical differences, population differences, I think Ireland's what, 5.5 million. We're talking, what, 55, 56 million here in the UK. And they're a much more centralised system, I think, in Ireland as well. They also have a state-run bus operator as well. But we can, of course, learn from other areas. We've been doing that in terms of identifying various models of franchising that we can explore. I was in Jersey, in fact, a couple of weeks ago now. They're doing a fantastic job there. They've had franchising now for quite some time. From memory, their latest contract started in 2013, and they've seen something like a 47% increase in passenger numbers, which is significant. Look, I think that local authorities share our ambition for buses.
Norfolk doesn't.
Well,
Norfolk's a car county, that's what they told us, the leader told us 3 years ago.
Yeah, but I think this is about going back to that fundamental point at the beginning, is how do we restore trust in our public transport? How do we incentivise people to leave their cars behind? In Jersey, which I just mentioned, and I'll check the numbers, it's north of 55% of people in Jersey have cars but decide not to use them in peak times because the bus is easier, it's more reliable. I think local authorities generally have great ambition, and our job obviously is to make sure that we give them the tools and the funding to deliver that, and they will reap the benefits of that, ensuring that people are able to get to those well-paid jobs, are able to access education, or able to reach their NHS appointments, etc.
I very much hope you can inspire the ambition to be shared across our rural communities. That's clearly a job in itself. Of course, the backstop to ambition is minimum level of service requirements. And I wondered if you can tell us, either of you, anything about the department's view on introducing things like guaranteed minimum service level for buses in those areas that are underserved.
What I don't want to do is I don't want to dictate from the centre or take power away from communities. I think we need to give the local leaders the power to shape their services. Because by dictating, I think you can almost miss the opportunity of things like community transport or demand-responsive transport by automatically making the assumption that bus is always going to be the best means. Often, some of those other forms can offer better service and more value for money for passengers. That being said, members will be aware that there is an element within the bus services bill which asks local transport authorities under an enhanced partnership to identify socially necessary bus services. And that's really about ensuring that the passenger is at the heart of everything that they do, so that when there is considerations to change or to cancel bus services, that we consider the impact that will have on the community and on passengers. Now, every possible effort is made to mitigate those impacts on communities, such as, for example, looking at community transport or demand-responsive transport.
Sure, I appreciate that. But if you give local authorities the power to decide what a socially necessary route is, and also have to, we'll come on to this. Okay, we'll leave that for a moment. We'll come on to this in a second, I suppose. I mean, I guess coming on to that, are there other mechanisms that you're intending on using to support local authorities to improve connectivity? And I would just challenge you on one of the things that you've said, if I may, Minister, which is that I get that you want to give power and autonomy to local authorities, but there is some widely regarded social science around what makes a service viable in terms of frequency. I get your point about modal choice, that needs to be done on a local level. But again, I wonder if I could just bring us back to that. How do we make sure that the ambition is cascaded into these communities, and that this agenda, which I think we're interested in your level of enthusiasm for, actually makes it out into the field?
So can I say, particularly in areas where there doesn't seem to be that, where bus services don't seem to be a political priority for the local leadership. Devolution is great, but there are big differences in approach, as Steph has shown as an example from Norfolk. The thing about Ireland is there was a national focus on significantly improving rural bus transport across the whole country. So how do you deal with those distinctions with different political priorities?
Sure, and obviously we talked about with the Bus Centre of Excellence in terms of getting those individuals together to share that best practice. I think we're obviously incentivising that through our funding, through our consolidated funding out to local areas, and setting that really high ambition with the public in terms of those better connections to places that people need to get to, in terms of reliability, which you touched upon, faster, more integrated transport, and that passengers feel safe, obviously, as well, at all parts of the journey. And also, I think it's about empowering those passengers in terms of information as well. I don't know if you want to come in terms of the extra incentives that we've been...
I think the sort of couple of other things I'd add is firstly that the funding reform the Minister talked about a few minutes ago, that was very much designed about moving to a formula approach which gave people a degree of certainty based around their need for service, and is a better reflection of rural areas and their need going forward. And I think hopefully when we come out the other side of the spending review, and we obviously can't preempt that, we'll be in a position to give that forward certainty, which will help with some of that planning. And then alongside that, I think with devolution comes an importance for transparency around those local decisions and accountability. So one of the other areas we are working on at the moment is what are the kind of common set of outcomes for passengers, the things exactly as you're saying that really matter to passengers about services that we'd like to understand and have publicly available on a transparent basis across all the local transport authorities. So there is that ability for local accountability about how one particular authority is doing compared to another, how they're using that funding, what choices they're making. And we're starting that work with some of the wider authorities at the moment. But if you look at the integrated settlements, I know it's not a rural context, but for West Midlands and for Greater Manchester, we've got quite a wide set of indicators in there that relate to bus, which are exactly the kind of areas focused absolutely on the social science around what matters for passengers and what drives growth that we are looking to potentially extend elsewhere.
I think our guidance is very clear as well to local transport authorities. When they're looking at the transport network, they're looking at the whole transport network, not just the urban areas, but the whole transport network, including rural and suburban areas.
Just to be clear, when you're talking about transport authorities, you're meaning combined mayoral authorities?
We're talking about all local transport authorities. At the moment, it's in place for the integrated settlements, but we're looking to sort of roll that out on a pilot basis this year and then into our future funding regime for elsewhere as well.
So there's an outcomes framework which we've agreed obviously with places like Manchester and Liverpool already, and we're trying to use that same model when it comes to other local transport authorities.
We are, just to be clear, we're really focused specifically on non-urban areas in this inquiry, so very, very keen in particular to hear how that works as we go forwards. I'm in danger of running into other people's questioning areas, so I'll leave it there. Thank you both very much.
Okay, thank you. Catherine, did you have a
No,
you're okay. Baggy.
Thanks, Chair. So in your written evidence, you referred to rural franchising pilots. What are the main questions, issues you're trying to tease out and explore through these pilots?
So I think it's obviously, I guess it's wanting to identify the various. There's an assumption. There's an assumption when you think about franchising. People automatically turn to the Manchester model. And I think we know that isn't necessarily, most probably isn't going to be the model that all local transport authorities are able to adopt, which is why we're looking at different areas. We're looking internationally as well. So Jersey model, for instance, is an example. There's models which include design responsive transport, and others that share the risk a little bit more. I don't know if you're going a bit more detail in terms of some of the models we've been exploring.
Yeah, very happy to. I think there are probably
particularly for a rural perspective, like Jersey, I think would be a good.
I think there's sort of 3 or 4 different models that are in our mind at the moment. But I think a really important point is this is sort of our thinking from within the department, having talked to colleagues and looked internationally. What we really want to do is work some real authorities in some real places based on the real situations they're facing to develop these further and make sure they work in a rural context here. But the kind of thing we've got in mind is growing a franchise network out of your existing tendered services. If you've already got a lot of tendered services, making them properly integrated with the rest of the network so you don't have a big bang necessarily overnight approach in Manchester, that feels to us something that could be done on a much more transitional basis with the kind of skills, resources, capability an authority has. There's the Jersey model, as the Minister's talked about. There are also options where you could potentially use it to make sure that if DRT is a key part of your service, that you're integrating that far more effectively with fixed routes, and it's one network, and franchising is a tool that allows you to influence that with some commercial input, some authority leadership. But also then there's a sort of extreme end of the spectrum is what we sort of tend to call micro-franchising, which is just about not doing your whole area. It's about dealing with a specific problem in a specific place to really make sure that you are solving that local problem and coming up with the right kind of bespoke solution. So I think we are really, really keen that we are developing models that really work for the skill sets and the context of more rural authorities.
So you mentioned Jersey. Are there any specific parts of that model you think could be used in England?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are 3 or 4 things I'd pull out. I mean, the first for me would be really around the commercial input. So, rather than the local authority saying, I want this service to run from here to here, the way Jersey went about this is they had a sort of reference network, but ultimately they drew on the commercial skills of a local authority partner, an operator partner, once they'd awarded that contract. And then they set up a mechanism through, it's actually a profit share in this case, where actually everybody's incentives are aligned to drive the right outcomes, and they are really focused on what connectivity do they need. And then they are drawing on the commercial skill set to actually help them deliver that. And there's a bit of flexibility around whether that's a fixed route bus service, a DRT, potentially even taxi at the extreme end of the solution. So it's very much an outcome, passenger-focused approach, rather than we, the local authority, absolutely know how to deliver transport services in detail, which I think is really, really interesting. And there's quite a bit of flexibility as well as accountability in that system with the operator. So everybody's aligned, pointing in the same direction.
Okay, and then just finally, when do you think the evaluation of the pilots will be published?
So these pilots aren't about creating a report. In all honesty, this is about creating practical tools for local transport authorities. So as and when we create those learnings, if you like, develop those understandings, we're wanting to share those in real time with local transport authorities through things like the Bus Centre of Excellence. Obviously, once the pilots begin, we'll begin evaluating them instantaneously. We'll continuously do that and continuously feed in that to local transport authorities so they're able to benefit from that insight as soon as possible.
Rebecca, did you want to come in at this point?
Yeah, I mean, this could probably come in under several of these questions, but obviously the ambition is laudable in terms of this rural franchising piece. And obviously Jersey sounds like a great example. Obviously it's an island, so there's a limit to how many routes are going to be necessary based on where people live. Yeah. So I suppose just segueing off that, all of this work is being done at the same time as local government reorganisation is taking place, where some urban areas are seeking to sort of expand into rural areas, where the urban areas already don't have enough service, let alone then providing it into the rural areas as well. So I suppose, one of my questions is, what conversations are you having about LGR and how this actually is applied to that? But also, you know, all of this relies on a critical mass, and if there isn't a critical mass in those rural areas, and I appreciate what you're saying about community transport and things like that, but you know, where I live in the kind of urban part of Devon, we already have commercial services and they only run where there is that need. So I suppose it's a rounded question on the LGR piece particularly, but how are you going to make sure that even in a commercial, you know, where there is no commercial viability and those LGR boundaries are changing, how does that bus franchise model overlap with that?
So I think the powers that we're seeking to give local authority leaders allow them under things like franchising to look at the whole network. So that includes your urban and rural areas, and where, you know, often urban routes will be more profitable, they're able to offset sometimes the less profitable routes in your rural areas, which I think is really important. Obviously, you know, there can be instances at the moment where there is issues with cross-border. Obviously, there will be, fundamentally, as a result of local government reorganisation, there will be less boundaries as well. So there can be a consequence of that. Also, I think larger authorities can often mean more resource when it comes to bus teams, for instance. They have more capability and capacity often as well. Is there anything you want to add on that?
I think I'd just add that it's entirely possible to do a franchising scheme or a partnership across multiple areas. Yeah. So we're very alive to the sort of strategic authority and local government reform issue, and you know, if there is an area where, you know, there is appetite amongst the constituent authorities, we are trying to build into our thinking how could we work collectively with them, so that's not a blocker. But obviously, you know, it does pose some challenges in terms of not knowing what the leadership of that authority may be, and what that may mean. In some places decisions have to come a bit later, but that's not going to stop us cracking on with people who are ready to go.
I think this goes back to the pilots as well, making sure that the range of pilots that we're doing includes areas with high rural areas and bigger geographies, or areas with less people. Because when you look at, again, I laboured the Jersey point, but you look at Jersey, they managed to achieve that on 3 to 4 offices. In stark contrast when you start and consider the scale of the work that had to be done in Manchester. So we're very much looking to make sure that the pilots that we do help inform a wide variety of areas in different contexts.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair. We've heard different views from people on the viability of rural franchising. What are your thoughts on rural franchising, and what are the main challenges that you anticipate?
I think some of the main challenges in rural areas is around passenger numbers, obviously, and the commercial viability of those services as a result. Obviously, empowering those local leaders to take control of those services is fundamental. And we talked about the pilots that we're doing, specifically looking at rural areas there as well. So obviously the bus grant, that's gone forward there as well, and then a change to previous funding rounds, which tended to be on a competition basis, where people are kind of all fighting for that finite pot. We did that on, I think, a fairer formula model, which I think has ensured and will particularly benefit, I think, you know, your smaller suburban and rural areas who tended not to get money in that previous context. I think that's what I'd say on that one.
Yeah, I think I agree. That we talked about the size of the teams. I think that's exactly why we're looking at some different models in part. I think there's also possibly something around making sure we really have something that works for some of the SMEs that are in a rural context too. And I think there's something there about learning from the experience that authorities already have of tendering networks and not necessarily thinking about franchising as being fundamentally different. Actually, at the end of the day, it's ultimately a way of delivering service contracts in the same way as you would a tendered network today. So we want to really work with some of the smaller operators as well as some of the local authorities in that context to make sure that whatever models we work up with them actually do work for the kind of bus market that's already in place in those kind of rural contexts.
And if it were a kind of blunt yes or no, do you think franchising works in rural areas? Sort of some of the witnesses we said have basically said no, but it sounds like you're saying yes, or maybe, or sometimes.
I think it can. I think that's why we're doing the pilots, to make sure that we have models that can work for all cases. I think, in all honesty, I appreciate the geographical restrictions on Jersey, but it does have rural areas. And I think that's a great example of where you can achieve franchising with a small number of staff, and you can really benefit because of that profit share, etc. And working with the local provider, you can benefit from the commercial experience and skills as well to supplement the work done within the LTA. Because obviously we all recognise there can be challenges when it comes to capacity and capability. Obviously, we've given funding which should cover at least one extra bus officer. But I think that model will allow rural areas, smaller authorities, etc., to be able to achieve franchising. But obviously, that's what we're looking to test with the pilots as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think Jersey is somewhat smaller in area than some of our rural areas like
Indeed.
Norfolk.
And Kent.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And Kent.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay, Scott.
So I do want to start with a question about Jersey, actually, before I go into what I was going to ask. But first, Steph mentioned, of course, Ireland. We didn't have to go to Ireland to see a fantastic bus service. We've got a publicly owned one in Edinburgh which reaches right into the rural areas. I do have to give a shout out to Lothian buses. But Simon, you kind of dismissed talk of Ireland by saying it's a much smaller country than England. I mean, Jersey's not the same size as England, though, is it? So what is it about Jersey that makes it a good comparator, but Ireland isn't a good one? What is it?
Yeah, no, I don't dismiss it. It's a different approach, obviously. As I said, it's a different context in terms of there's a much more centralised approach in Ireland, and obviously, as I said, they have their own nationalised bus service there as well. I think
which is a good thing, a nationalised bus service, isn't it?
I think there's a degree of affordability there, and I think what's important to me is that we are able to empower local areas to make those decisions. Again, I think that's really important because there is differences in each and every one of our communities, and that requires that local knowledge, that local connection with an area in order to achieve that. What attracts me and why I was so impressed with the Jersey model is because it adds that extra skill, that extra capacity to a local transport authority. They set the vision. They set the kind of contractual kind of limitations, but then they use that expertise from those private providers to supplement their skill set and share the financial burden, if you like, but get to share in the rewards as well, which means when they get their profit share, they're able to reinvest that back into buses, bus improvement measures, and you start that virtuous cycle as well. So I see that as a really a more accessible potential a way of achieving franchising.
Yeah, which is exactly what happens in Edinburgh as well, because Lothian buses' profits come right back into the city, which is a good thing. So this line about empowering local leaders to shape services, and you also say take control as well of services. I mean, that's fantastic in a press release, but it doesn't really mean anything if local authorities don't have funding to use those powers. So are they going to have sufficient funding to actually make a difference when it comes to when they get these powers?
Sure. I mean, obviously, we're invested something like £1 billion in buses just in 25-26. Something like over £700 million is going directly to local authorities to do whatever they see fit to spend that money on in terms of improving buses for passengers. And obviously, in addition to that, we've got a whole support package around how do we support local authorities in terms of their enhanced partnerships, in terms of identifying the right model for them when it comes to improving bus services.
And that level of funding is sufficient to deploy those franchising powers?
And this is why we're doing the pilots. I think what's often quoted when it comes to the Manchester model is something like £700 million to £1 billion I've heard quoted on Manchester. I think our kind of analysis is about around 135 million. But since then, obviously, that took them a long time. was a complicated, they were kind of the trailblazer, and good for them. They've really kind of shown what is possible. But we've obviously done a lot of work now in terms of streamlining, making that process quicker, easier and cheaper, as well as the support that we're offering to local areas to support them through that process.
Okay, I mean, Manchester's always interesting, of course, because of the PR around it, but it's also, I guess you have to dig into the detail and see actually which things work and which can be transferred.
Yeah.
So one of the challenges operators say in terms of running a franchise service is getting data in relation to routes, but also more importantly passenger levels from existing commercial operators. So is that something you're considering obliging commercial operators to do, to share that data with authorities who are considering running franchise services? I know it's quite a sensitive area.
No, it's not at all. I think local transport authorities have already got legal powers to request that data when they're considering franchising.
Okay.
So that already exists. Operators are required by law to provide that data when they're considering that, and also going beyond that now within the bus services bill. There's elements in there about data transparency. So we're looking to create almost a consolidated database which will bring in elements of bus registration and the whole the bus open data BODS service data into one single database. Yeah. And that will allow local authorities, in terms of designing their systems, will allow operators, will allow the public to understand more about their bus services, including that kind of real-time information, which I think is really important.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that goes, just as a side bit, goes somewhere towards our ambition of making our public transport network safer, and the perception safer as well. If people accept buses are going to be late sometimes. It happens. But if they know, they can say on a map, it's 10 minutes behind. I'll leave the house 10 minutes later. I'm not standing in a cold, wet bus stop or a dimly lit bus stop. So I think data can be really empowering. But I think this, going back to your original question, because I go off in a tangent there.
It's all exciting stuff.
Is that there's already a legal obligation to provide that. We want to further expand that with our single database solution there, which I think will benefit everybody.
Of course, in Edinburgh, we already have live bus tracking data and apps and all the rest of it. So
we often do now, is putting it in one single place. So if you make that available, for instance, to your Google Maps and your Apple Maps, etc. So there's it's open for all those issues.
And that'll be in a consistent format, so operators are absolutely excellent. Back to you, Chair.
Okay. Did you want to just pick up
I
on
think
that,
Scott
Catherine?
covered it, but it was about consistency of data. Because if different providers are giving slightly different data, then it's just not usable. So with your plan for one central data sharing, it would be to require the same data from everyone.
Absolutely, and I think that increases the transparency. And so we're obviously designing that database now. That'll go out to tender and be in place in due course. But I think lots of these, I don't think it's going to add more burden onto anybody. I think the data is already commonly collected. As you said, obviously that GPS data is often commonly collected already. It's about putting in that single location that you can then share in a consistent way.
Is there slightly something different, though, about other measurements? So not just when things are going to arrive, but looking at performance data as well?
Yeah. And I think if I'm coming on that, the performance data, things like the punctuality data are all part of the thinking around the kind of outcomes that matter for passengers that we talked about before. So we're very keen to get that data out there very clearly and transparently on a local authority basis, on a regular basis across the country. I think just on the franchising point and this, that power, as we say, does exist. You have to have done the formal notice that you are starting the franchising process before you can use that power at the moment. So I think partly what you probably heard from some of the previous witnesses was people who are starting to think about franchising might not have that information at their fingertips now until they've taken that decision they want to look at it. But that is a decision I want to look at it, not a decision I'm going to do it. So I think it's a bit of work we need to do to make sure everybody understands that. But I think, as the Minister says, the wider data we're making available will help provide that context to inform that decision. And we already have the Bus Open Data Service, which has got lots of this, but it's just not comprehensive around things like registration data that will allow things like punctuality to be properly monitored everywhere on a really automated type basis. So that's absolutely what we're working on.
Okay. Alex, what's that?
Over here. Thank you, Chair. Moving on to enhanced partnerships now. We've had mixed evidence. The Confederation for Passenger Transport have called it a valuable tool. We've also had evidence that suggested that they were no more than goodwill documents. Is the department, or does the department have plans to reform enhanced partnerships? For example, allowing local transport authorities to subsidise services that compete with commercial services, or to have further legal obligations to try and get operators to stick to agreed services?
So, first and foremost, I think it's important to say that enhanced partnerships are hugely valuable in terms of delivering those better bus services. I think we've seen some great partnerships out there. Certainly not there is statutory partnership, certainly not just a piece of paper. And obviously, if an operator within that partnership fails to comply with a local transport authority, there is the option to escalate that to the traffic commissioner. So there is some teeth behind that as well, which I think is important. It's an incentive to obviously make sure that happens. As you're aware, following conversations with the previous Transport Select Committee, who recommended that we do a review of enhanced partnerships, that work is underway. And I think stakeholders generally look very favourably upon enhanced partnerships. It was something like 96% of respondents said that enhanced partnerships have fully or partly met the goal of helping LTAs and bus operators work together better to meet their kind of BSIP objectives. And I think you've seen some great work. Devon, Norfolk have done some fantastic work and some low-cost ideas in places like East Sussex, who've put things like a QR code on every bus step so you can get the real-time information. So I think they are performing well. The point of the evaluation, if you like, is how do we ensure that the learnings are shared to raise the standard across the board. There's less mature enhanced partnerships out there. How do we fast-track them to become more mature and deliver better results? Do you think there was a bit about commercial?
Yeah, happy to pick that up. I think there are a few things we're doing that will help in that space. So the power in the bus bill about local grants, that will allow local authorities, should they want to use the money that we've given to design a local grant that could be applied to all operators. So you could say, for example, we're going to pay a set mileage for all services that support this kind of rural connectivity or whatever else. So that would allow you to fund commercial and non-commercial services on a kind of consistent basis. I think sort of my personal view would be ultimately if you were looking to sort of subsidise effectively competing with commercial services, you'd probably want to look at one of the franchising type models and look at the system in the round if that's the situation you find yourself in, assuming we succeed in making them suitably accessible, that will work in your context. Probably the only other thing I'd add is one of the things we're doing through the review is absolutely recognising the variability the Minister talked about and you mentioned, and really thinking hard about what are both the low and no cost things, but also the things that can be done where there is funding that just make a difference to passengers. So really focusing in on things like punctuality and reliability doesn't cost a huge amount of money, but it does require leadership, focus and collective drive to take it through in a lot of circumstances. And I think there are things like that, things like marketing, things like ticketing, things like just really making sure, as that example in East Sussex, the information at the bus stop is of sufficient quality. Everything we see from the Your Bus Journey data from Transport Focus suggests those basics really can drive satisfaction, and that's the kind of thing we're trying to get out of the review, is trying to lift that expectation up on a more universal basis.
I think that grant point is really important. Local areas need to set those grant conditions to incentivise the behaviours and the changes that they want to see in their local area, which will be different across different geographies and areas of the country. So again, it's another way of empowering them to shape and take control of their bus services.
And then, obviously, in the bus services bill, there are extra rules in terms, as you mentioned, of trying to make sure that there's this list of supported services that is agreed by all parties. But that only is applicable for enhanced partnerships. It's not applicable for franchised services. it would appear that we're moving in the direction of more and more franchise services. So what kind of safeguards do you think are going to be necessary to put in place in franchised areas to deal with the same problem that you're sorting out in the bus bill for EPs?
Yeah, no, certainly, and I take your point. Obviously, within the bus bill, there's the socially necessary bus services. I think that the same kind of consideration is undertaken when a local transport authority is considering the move to franchising. So they need to demonstrate clearly the benefit to the community. I'm actually minded to look again at whether or not the socially necessary bus service rules, if you like, could be extended to franchises as well. It's a conversation I've been having with Stephen because I think it could still be valuable that at least the public are aware, obviously. I think it happens anyway, but the public are aware that when those changes are considered, that the passengers are front and centre of that. Because I think that's, as a department, as a government, that's the fundamental thing. Passengers are the centre of everything that we do in public transport. So I'm sympathetic to that point that you've made. Thank you for making it. Give me a chance to say that on the record, but it is something I'm going to look at and have those conversations to see whether or not we can strengthen that area when it comes to franchising, so they too have those protocols, those processes to go through when it comes to socially necessary bus routes.
Thank you. Is there anything you wanted to still push on, Lawrence?
A little. Thank you, Chair. Just to press a little further on the review, which I think we're expecting in the summer on enhanced partnerships. With the allowance that we'll learn what's in the review when it's published, but at this stage, what would you say the main areas of findings are likely to be about how EPs can be improved, and what do you see the role of the central department being in terms of either encouraging, supporting, or indeed compelling transport authorities and operators to carry those through?
I'm going to gracefully look at my colleague who's been very close to the enhanced partnership review.
Yeah, we're sort of still in sort of phase 2 of the review. So phase 1 of the review was very much looking at the legislative framework. So everything about enhanced partnerships that's in the bus services bill came out of that first phase of the review. So we've got things in the bill already in terms of the flexibility of the content, to just give a bit more flexibility there for authorities, about making sure that the objection mechanism for operators is not used unreasonably, and that works effectively for passengers. We've got some provisions around variation and about making sure the information provision, which actually is similar to the one we talked about for franchising, that works effectively with the right kind of notice for operators as well. So that's kind of what we've done already from it. The next phase is really trying to learn both around how does the kind of governance locally work effectively, and it comes back, I think, to the point earlier about the variability of them feeling like really effective, through to perhaps pieces of paper that don't work brilliantly well. So what do the really good ones do? So we've looked at places like Leicester who've done some fantastic stuff. If you look at Leicester, they've delivered over 100 commitments over 3 years between them. They've transformed 1,200 bus stops, and actually they've got service levels that I think are up about 6% from pre-COVID, and that is about the quality of the enhanced partnership work that's been done together. It's about the local leadership. That is coming through really clearly, and I think, again, comes out some of the earlier conversations about needing to have that local leadership, both at officer level, but actually at political level as well, that this matters and is being driven forward. But then those minimum, what we're calling minimum standards, what might be the minimum standards that we would expect all EPs to have going forward if we're expecting that authority to receive departmental funding. And I don't want to prejudge what they might be at this stage, because the review is ongoing and ministers will need to decide that. But I think the kind of things I talked about earlier on are very much sort of in play as the kind of options there.
Thank you. And you referenced a city authority, but are there specific lessons that you're learning about enhanced partnerships in less densely populated areas?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, East Sussex is quite a good one for me, as we talked about before, in terms of quality of collaboration. And I appreciate the points made earlier about Norfolk and some of the kind of political leadership in the past there. I think at a sort of working level, what we're seeing there is some really good collaboration actually between officers and the operators on a day-to-day basis. And a sort of join up on some of that I hadn't seen before in terms of some of the kind of county multi-wide operator ticketing. And I think even if it is a city context in Leicester, actually I don't think it's a city-specific solution. The things that we can learn from Leicester are actually about how the engagement works, what information is provided to passengers. I think a lot of that is entirely transferable to a rural context too. So I think the learning can be applied from one to another.
Thank you, Lawrence. Did you want to...
Yeah, just a really quick question, and I think this could come in pretty much anywhere during this conversation, so I'll put it in here. But obviously a whole load of this relies on local authorities and commercial organisations being able to make it viable. So what are you feeling, I suppose, or how are you planning on tackling what will effectively still be not spots in rural areas for bus transport, and what do you anticipate being the kind of solution to that? Because obviously there's great ambition, this buses bill, but if you live in a village, you could be led to believe, a bit like with your broadband, you're going to get this great service, and then suddenly everyone decides it's not deliverable, it's too difficult, and they're in exactly the same position as they're already in. So what are you thinking?
Particularly the funding.
Yeah.
Particularly on funding.
Yeah. The funding seems to be, the unanswerable. So where are you on funding for these areas, the not spots, as Rebecca mentioned?
I think you've already seen, obviously, in the changes that we've made to our approach to the bus grant, that consolidated BSIP and BSOC funding, because it's done on a formula basis, all local transport authorities, including more rural and suburban areas, have received funding, sometimes for the first time in a long time. We think that's a fairer approach, rather than that competition-based, where it tended to be your bigger urban areas that were benefiting from that. I'm going to add bits to the...
Yeah, and I think I'd say sort of on specifics of that, around sort of 30 authorities in the announcement we made last year, really got significant increasing in their funding for services. As Mr. says, they tended to be more rural areas, not exclusively, but places like Blackburn, Kent, Devon, all got pretty significant increases in their funding from what they'd seen before. And I think they should help address in some circumstances. But obviously the spending review will be the crucial moment for the government to take its decisions.
That's crucial to say that's an interim formula.
Yeah.
So we're going to continue to work with local transport authorities and operators to continue to kind of hone that approach. How do we best share that funding across the country to deliver the results that we need to see? And I guess bearing in mind the challenges faced by certain communities.
Okay, that's useful. We're going to come back to funding shortly as well. Now, Catherine.
Can I bring us back to socially necessary services? The buses bill will require transport authorities to identify socially necessary services within their enhanced partnerships. Can I start by asking in what ways you think that requirement will improve bus services?
Look, I think it's again. The word "you" is the issue there. I think it's what the local areas want to see from that. I think it's about empowering them to do that. What I would like to say, I guess, is that passengers, and I said this earlier on, are at the centre of that thinking. That there's a full exploration of the benefit that those services are providing to a community, and that passengers are satisfied that every possible mitigation is made before any changes or cancellations are made to a bus service. Touching upon, again, demand-responsive transport and community transport. And I think this reassures passengers that work has taken place. Hence my response to Alex there in terms of the consideration of franchisees as well, looking at this as well. I think it will support better decision-making, fundamentally.
We've heard evidence that the bill is a bit vague about what socially necessary means. What do you think can be done to ensure that everyone knows what it means?
So we'll look at guidance to give some guidance to local transport authorities about what they may want to include in that. I think it's up to, again, local areas to set what they think is socially necessary in their specific communities. Rather than us telling them what we think it should be, because I think it'll be different in different areas. There'll be different challenges, different demographics, different geographies. So I think that would be the crux of it.
The requirement seems to only apply to existing services, but in places like the East Midlands, where we've seen 60% of our routes cut, how are you going to take the next step in actually measuring the gaps in service and the gaps where really it is socially necessary but they don't exist?
And this goes back to the conversation and the work that's going to have to take place in each of those enhanced partnerships and possibly franchising about what kind of bus service do those local communities want to see, and then us empowering those local communities, the government empowering those local communities with the tools, the funding to achieve those objectives.
So does the requirement need to go further, not just in identifying those that are from existing services, but actually requiring them to identify those that don't currently exist?
I don't know if it does. I think that's part of the kind of accepted challenge for local transport authorities. They want to deliver the best possible service possible for their areas. I think obviously that those criteria could be used, but I think it's about protections and about reassurance to passengers that those existing services, that trust issue again, that every possible effort has been made to mitigate any future changes. They can trust that's going to be considered.
Is protecting what we already have go far enough when the aim is to improve it?
No, I take that point, but I think this is why we have bus service improvement plans. That's fundamentally what it's about. They're asked to consider as part of that their aspirations, and I would say as part of that we'd look at gaps in service. I would expect that. I'm sure that in guidance it says you need to take consideration of not just urban but rural areas, suburban areas, and that as well.
And I'd absolutely agree with that, and just say this is part of the suite.
Yeah.
So the bus service improvement plan is fundamentally about the change where you want to go forward, what you want your buses to look like in the future and the context. And I think what we're trying to do with the bill is probably three things. I mean, firstly, to really get absolute clarity of alignment between the operator and the local authority about which services are socially necessary. And I recognise actually most services in some places might fall into this category, but not necessarily everywhere. So if an operator is looking and saying, actually, I've got to do something here because of commercial viability, they have absolute clarity about the priorities of the local authority in a way that perhaps doesn't exist today, and that might inform operator decisions in the first place. I think secondly, you then have transparency. So there is already a duty in legislation around local authorities to consider what services need to be funded. They don't have to fund them, but they have to consider it. But there's nothing that makes that, what are the ones you think are important, what's your list of important services, transparent. So I think coming back to the theme of transparency, this will put that out there publicly, really clearly, what are the list of services at the moment we think are socially necessary. And then as the Minister says, it's about what happens if those services are at risk. And rather than...
or want to be recreated after some years
absolutely.
Of not being there.
Yes, and about making sure that you don't just lose a service because people don't look creatively about what things could be done about it, whether there are things that could be done, not necessarily at all with funding, but about attracting passengers to that, about maybe changing service patterns, maybe about how you actually perhaps do something around bus priority or something else that makes that service more viable rather than just accepting it's a service that would go in some way, shape or form. So that's what we're trying to do, I think.
So I understand it. If you've got a local authority that is a bit lukewarm on the whole concept of upping the bus, a local authority like Norfolk that you said, Steph said, sees itself as a...
Norfolk is a car county, we were told.
Yeah, so if you've got a county or an area that sees itself as a car-orientated, you're therefore putting the onus on the local communities themselves to campaign for socially responsible... bus services, new bus services. So the communities are going to have to make the case themselves if the local authority doesn't. Have I got that right?
I think the provisions in the bill are about it's mandating them to identify socially necessary bus services. So they have to do that as part of an enhanced
that, and then
partnership.
If there are still no-go areas, the communities, villages, other communities are going to have to campaign themselves. They're going to have to make the case to their local authority if their local authority doesn't identify that area as a need. Have I got that right?
I think this goes back to the bus service improvement plan as well. That's the mechanism which they identify future kind of changes and improvements in their bus network, whereas the socially necessary bit is more about how do we protect and make sure there's processes when it comes to the degradation.
But as we keep saying, there are so many areas that are actually now bus deserts where it was, it's in people's memories that there was a bus service, that there hasn't been. So are you can you just confirm socially necessary services are not just protecting existing, but also talking about identifying socially necessary services that are currently no longer there? Is that right?
I could see that being used for that. It'd be very clear the criteria that's being used, I think, by local transport authorities when ascertaining what is a socially necessary bus service in their area.
All the communities in those areas.
All the communities in those areas.
Yeah, the expectation is absolutely one for current and future, but this legislative measure is about existing services, because that's what you can sort of cover within the enhanced partnership context of services that exist today. But it's, the overall totality is absolutely about the aspiration and what should be there for communities.
Rebecca, you've got specific.
I mean, I suppose this is going to be quite an interesting debating point when the bill comes before the House, won't it? But I mean, it does sound like it all sounds quite subjective to me at the moment, and also when you're saying that you want local authorities to be making all these decisions, but the department's effectively going to set out this is what it sounds like, so correct me if I'm wrong, what is a socially necessary service? So there isn't going to be a central list?
No, what we'll do, we will provide guidance to help them come up with their socially necessary criteria, but I think it's important that local areas are able to consider and detail what those socially necessary services are for their individual communities and the individual challenges that they face. So I could see the read across there, Chair, in terms of, not just protecting the current services, but once they've kind of had that discussion, identified those services, there can be a read across there in terms of, well, is the current network providing that across? Is there opportunities within the bus service improvement plans to build upon those networks?
I mean, I suppose I would just gently push back on the LGR piece again, because again, when you've got these areas that are expanding their boundaries potentially, if it's left to them to decide what they think is important, they might that urban piece could still be. I mean, I've got a council in my area who wants some of the rural area, but is on record saying they don't do rural. So, if you've got a council that is already saying we don't understand how rural communities work, if that's not factored into this, I think that's potentially a problem going forward. Anyway, that wasn't my official question, sorry. Just in terms of the funding for all of this though, but I guess it links to what the Chair and others have been saying, is will the department provide ring-fenced funding for identified socially necessary services, or again, will councils be expected to fund them from existing budgets, and I guess therefore pick and choose whether they think it's suitable or whether society as a whole might think that those old people in that village should be able to access some local services?
No, I don't think the new measure will have extra funding associated with it. Again, LTAs and bus operators will kind of include that process that through existing mechanisms. And again, the power, I think, in terms of grant making and the bus grants that we already provide to support the bus service improvement plans, the BSIPs, will enable that work to be undertaken. And I think the bus grant, again, I think is a really important point, that they get to incentivise and shape those grants, rather than at the moment that being done by the Department of Transport. We think having those local levers will be really useful to local authorities.
In terms of the ring fencing, because you haven't answered that point, ultimately, I guess the purpose of this question is to potentially highlight that if it's not ring fenced, why should a council use that money to provide a socially necessary service and not provide something else? So I suppose if we think there are socially necessary services, surely it makes sense to ring fence that funding so that there's no wriggle room for that local authority or franchise or bus transport network to do that.
The direction of travel we tried to move in is to give local areas the freedom to use the funding to achieve their objectives, rather than us putting barriers in the way.
But surely they're not achieving those objectives already, so do we not need to give them an incentive to do that?
They're not, but we're giving them that simplified, consolidated funding, and we're giving them the powers, I think, and the support needed to achieve that, which hasn't been in there in the past, which has led to this erosion, I think, over time.
I mean, I think we're assuming that these people are going to actually do what they're supposed to do, rather than spend it on something else. Yeah.
We're not giving money specifically for social necessary bus. We're giving bus service improvement funding. It's a bus grant, so it could be used for whatever they see fit in order to improve buses in their community for passengers.
And it's probably worth adding, it's really explicit in our funding message to local authorities that this is money for buses, and very explicit that it's intended to be additional to their existing bus budgets, not replacing it. And that we are very clear with authorities that whilst it's not formally ring-fenced, if effectively it ends up not being spent on buses, we will have quite to think about what the right level of allocation for that authority is in the future, so that we can actually maximise the best bus outcomes across the country.
And I suppose there's just a point on, again, that definition of socially necessary, particularly when you have councils expanding, because again, back where I am in Devon, the city council will believe that it's deprived areas where people probably don't have a car could be seen as a socially necessary service, whereas if they're adopting some rural communities, to them socially necessary services might be being able to leave their car at home and travel to the town or the city to get to the doctors. So I suppose it's just that definition point that is going to be really critical, because it becomes incredibly subjective otherwise, and I think we're putting a lot on council leaders who probably have all the best intentions in the world but still have to make choices. And if we're talking about rural services, I guess it's just making sure that they're not the ones that still miss out once all of this legislation is in place.
I think Alex wanted to come in for, next.
So just on the councils identifying the socially necessary services, are you going to require councils to produce lists or the formula behind how they got to the list?
I haven't prescribed yet in terms of exactly how we...
I'm certainly expecting a list, but in terms of the detail, what the guidance says, and then effectively, to an extent, the formula will, I hope, be based off the kind of advice we give in the guidance, and then they'll be very clear what the services affected are, because that's what I was saying earlier, we want operators to know. So I think the list is actually going to be quite important at the end of the day.
Because it strikes me the formula is quite important, because otherwise it could literally be a list of whichever person in the community was shouting the loudest about any given bus, which wouldn't necessarily have an evidence base behind it.
I think the ask is obviously they'll need to set out what socially necessary bus service is for their particular area, I guess, and then the list would follow from that, because people need to, I guess, it goes back to accountability, doesn't it, and transparency about why those decisions have been made, and that all possible alternative routes are considered if those are changed or cancelled.
Politics of this could be quite interesting, but Steph?
Yeah, I mean, stepping back from who pays for it, one of the core principles of the Connecting Ireland programme is that socially necessary services, whatever that means, my personal view, it's an incredibly unhelpful definition that just causes great confusion, because the ambition surely should be, the whole point of public transport is that everybody wants to use it. And for example, in Norfolk, just to touch on the reality in rural North Norfolk as opposed to rural Norfolk as a whole, the council got less than half of what it asked for from the BSIP, spent most of that buying buses outright, which is extraordinary use of public funds, and improved just one route to one place in my constituency. The whole thing needs rewiring if it's going to make any real difference in North Norfolk, and I fear that may not be possible. But principally, would you agree that socially necessary services, or whatever, need some significant degree of public funding, public subsidy in order to work, regardless of where that comes from?
Well, I think we're providing that funding through the bus grant. Obviously, we're in challenging economic. We've got a challenging economic inheritance here. Funding needs to be clearly value for money for taxpayers, but there is a finite resource there that we're able to call upon there. But I think by giving that flexibility and not just the bus grant and work that we've done so far, but during the spending review, we're looking at other ways that we can, consolidate and devolve more funding down to local areas, because there's a whole patchwork of funding pots, as I learned when I came into the job, a whole plethora of funding that goes into buses. I think we need to look at how we again consolidate that a little bit and simplify that, so it is clearer where it's going and what its intentions are, and can be used for the things.
It's an enormous sense, and I recognise the description from almost every minister that I've spoken to since the election of the financial constraints. But of course, this is a case of investment in increased social mobility, accessibility, decarbonisation, reduction in road miles, and potentially economic growth. I would see public transport as a significant investment opportunity to drive economic growth, even in rural areas like mine. What you're saying is, I think, yes, but there's not quite enough. There's not quite enough money as we'd like, even if we consolidate it all together so we can see what we've got.
Listen, I think again it goes back to there's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
But overall, though, if we bring all the different pots of funding together, and you think about what a transformative vision for rural public transport could look like, it sounds like at the moment there's not enough money.
I don't think it's just about money. It's about, as I said, the powers and the partnership work that needs to take place there as well.
But do you accept that there's a significant requirement for public subsidy to make these routes work, at least in the first 5 or 6 years? And that's what we saw in Ireland, was that the change came 4 or 5 years after the initial investment was made.
Well, I think we were investing in terms of the bus grants, etc., in order to allow those local areas to invest. But again, they need to decide what their priorities are in that area. They understand the social and economic challenges in their specific area to make those interventions work.
I hear that at some level, but you'll forgive me for labouring the point. I don't think you can invest incrementally in transforming a network proposition. You have to go to the very biggest extent immediately in order for people to buy into the opportunity. It really is one of those rare examples of build it and they will come. You can't grow through increments in a declining service environment. That's an opinion. But from what you're saying, it sounds like, if there was more money on the table, you would do more with it. You'd see more being done with it.
You could say that about any part of policy and investment in public services. Of course, you'd like to put more money where you can. And obviously, as part of the spending review, we're putting our bids in accordingly. But I think, again, I go back to the point, this isn't just about funding. This is about using the funding that's available and putting it to best use and empowering those local people, those local leaders to use it in a way that makes the biggest difference to their communities.
But you'd agree that socially necessary routes require significant public subsidy?
Look, often they do, but then we talked about obviously the different models of franchising where you your urban routes are able to almost subsidise and help balance offset the challenges in rural areas, because you have more profitable routes tends to be in urban areas, for instance, because franchising you have to see the whole network. And that allows you then to help with the less profitable routes, the ones that can be deemed as commercially unviable.
Okay. I mean, well, let's remember, even in London, the buses are subsidised by the tube network. The London bus network is not viable on its own, and it's got very few rural areas. Just before we leave socially necessary routes, I just want to ask, what estimate has the department made of the proportion of routes that will be socially necessary, and therefore the amount of funding that would be required to support that service? Have you done that calculation?
Yeah, we're not setting the definition what is socially necessary bus routes. That's up to local areas to identify what they think is socially necessary in their communities. So it would be a difficult thing for us. But I take the point in terms of, is there enough funding to deliver that?
Right, well, we're going to move on to funding in the wider sphere. Elsie.
Thank you. Good morning, both. And yes, we're going to move on to funding more broadly now. Buses remain the most used form of public transport. And as you previously mentioned, actually, Minister, short-term funding settlements have prevented long-term planning. I've found, even in my constituency, which is in Greater Manchester, where I'm campaigning for a bus service, an express bus service from my constituency to the city centre, even though we've got a great mayor who's fully behind bus franchising and understands the importance of services like that to local communities, decisions have been constrained by the national funding environment in the past. What's the department doing to fix this?
Fundamentally, what I want to do is to see us move away from those short-term funding models that we've seen in the past. It's created too much uncertainty, too many cliff edges, and obviously future funding, here it comes, will be a matter for the spending review. It had to get in there somewhere. And that will help us review our goal to simplify, as I said, and go further in terms of how do we simplify and consolidate some of that funding to give maximum flexibility to local areas. And we'll be exploring how we do that further as part of the spending review. I also want to, and I'm sure you share this view, want to give multi-year settlements. I think that will be a really big deal for local authorities in having that certainty over a number of years with that more control and more flexibility over that bus funding, so they can plan ahead more strategically in terms of their investment over a longer period of time.
And you recently introduced a deprivation metric for BSIPs. I really welcome this, and I'm sure other committee members do too. But services obviously need to be financially viable, at least they need to wash their faces. How do you balance the two, do you think? So being cognizant of deprivation, but also making sure under franchising and maybe enhanced partnerships too, the system is demand responsive.
Yeah. Look about the formula. Maybe let's go into a bit more detail about
certainly.
It.
So the core of the formula was based around sort of three things really. It was the population, so we were taking a bit of the sort of number of people who potentially use service. There was the deprivation aspect, recognising a bit of a proxy for who's got car ownership, the sort of need and importance of bus services, but also actually what's the sort of size of the bus network at the moment, so what's the kind of level of support that might be in there. So we're trying to balance out some of those factors within the formula itself as a starter. And ultimately, there is a key role for the local authorities in terms of testing the value for money. I think some of our role comes out to what the Minister was saying about sort of best practice support and expectations of actually really helping some of those choices, and perhaps less so for Greater Manchester, but in what circumstances might demand responsive transport be a better, more effective solution for connectivity than, say, a traditional fixed bus route is exactly the kind of space where we want to sort of be assisting and supporting.
We do have rural areas within Greater Manchester, but sort of it'd be interesting to know whether there are plans for the new BSIP formula to include weighting for rural areas as well.
I think that's obviously as part of the work that we're talking about doing as part of the spending review, and also so going backwards, this original formula is an interim formula, so we are actively looking at how we continue to evolve that. So that could be one of the areas that we'll explore as part of that.
Okay, so potentially. And just sort of finally for me on this section, on cross-subsidy, which is a really important topic in Greater Manchester, how are you going to make sure that this works effectively? So from more affluent areas with more demand, and in Greater Manchester I think of the Oxford Road corridor, for example, to less prosperous ones where services are still essential. How are you making sure that's happening effectively?
It comes back down to the identification of socially necessary bus services, and also the ambition of BSIP, in clearly articulating the vision there for bus services and the development of bus services. And obviously guidance dictates, you need to take in consideration the entire community to make sure that there's that level playing field, that fair approach.
Okay.
You mentioned your wish to move to a kind of long-term multi-year funding settlement, which I know will be music to the ears of lots of people who've spoken to us. Notwithstanding appeasing the gods of the spending review, what sort of thing, how would 5 years, say, sound to you? What kind of time frame are we looking at, do you think?
I think we're looking at a 3-year day-to-day spending, 4 years in terms of capital spending. Now, I think that seems to be the direction to travel. Every couple of years, I believe there'll be a multi-year kind of funding settlement. I think that'll give greater assurance, greater certainty, because it comes across so often. If I was to go back to my shadow days and then into government, that word certainty was the single most used word by everybody, and the lack of certainty that was holding back and undermining trust and the ability to improve services.
Okay, thank you. Alex?
Thank you, Chair. Does the department have a bus fare strategy?
Obviously, I think buses offer a fantastic value for money in getting people to where they want to be. Obviously, there might be some intimation there in terms of the fare cap. If we hadn't have acted in terms of changing the £2 to the £3 fare cap, there was no funding beyond 2024 to maintain any form of cap, and it was important that, I think unforeseen costs are almost the worst to deal with. If we hadn't intervened, that could have meant a significant cliff edge when it came to bus fares, particularly actually in rural areas who tend to benefit the most. Important on the back of that, I guess, though, to emphasise that that's only helping in 1 in 6 of the journeys, and I think so far we've seen increasing use in things like weekly travel cards, etc. But with the flexibility that we've incorporated in the bus grant, obviously local areas have and are looking to do their own bus subsidies as well. So you see that in Greater Manchester and in the Liverpool city region as well, who are using their funding given to them through CRCS and the bus grant to keep those fares down. Cornwall, I think, are using some funding on a more targeted basis when it comes to tourism, for instance. But again, I think it's about giving the power and the funding to local areas to do those local interventions that could have perhaps the biggest bang for their buck in terms of achieving better buses in their individual communities.
So I absolutely take your point that the funding was about to run out, there was a cliff edge. When the £2 fare cap was introduced, it was very clearly introduced as a cost of living measure. As you've rightly said, the £3 cap, much less so, because so few of the tickets actually cost £3. If I get on a bus from Leighton Buzzard Station to Tesco's, it's something like £2.10, so it doesn't apply. So therefore, what is the £3 bus cap now for? Is it now a measure for subsidising rural buses only? So then back to my question again. So what is the department's bus fare strategy? Because it still has this cap in place, but what are you trying to achieve? Is it just to subsidise rural buses, or does the department have an idea that fares could be used to increase ridership, change people out of cars onto buses, or is it still a cost of living measure? What's it for?
I think the drivers behind the fare cap initially were, yes, as a cost of living measure, but it was also about recovery from the pandemic. About getting people back onto buses. Clearly, the £3 bus fare cap is most benefiting those longer routes. It's most benefiting those rural areas where those fares tended to be significantly higher. I think that's a good thing. But I think, with the funding and the flexibility that we're providing, local interventions, or perhaps have the potential to reap, better rewards in a local area, because, there's different social and economic challenges in different areas. And I think that's perhaps the best approach under the circumstances that we could achieve.
So would it therefore better perhaps just to give them the local authorities the chunk of money and let them decide whether what the bus fares are?
That's exactly what we're doing through the bus grant. They can use that money to introduce improvements in the bus network. They can to maintain services that aren't commercially viable, to improve bus infrastructure or fare initiatives in their local area. But of course, what I'd also say, I guess, is look, I think 73 out of 85. In 70 out of 85 areas, commercial bus operators are also putting in place concessionary fares, if you like, to incentivise bus use. So yes, of course, we want to see more people using bus. We want to see it as accessible and affordable as possible. And I think, but by giving, again, there's obviously a theme here of giving local areas the flexibility to design that for their individual needs, I think is important.
Okay. Catherine.
I've had young people and families say how hard it can be to cover the bus fare to get to college or to school. So has the department considered reviewing policies around concessionary fares to offer more consistent support for young people in education and in low-income work?
I know that in terms of the ENCTS, there's a review that's been undertaken on ENCTS, so we're looking again at that. I mean, that costs something like £700 million at the moment, in terms of giving the elderly and disabled access to free bus travel. I think any expansion of that, we need to maintain the financial kind of stability of the scheme, obviously. But going back to my point a second ago, that local areas can already supplement the NCTS. They can, and many do already, have youth concession schemes paid for locally or using their bus grant to do so.
We have youth concession schemes, but it varies from provider to provider, which is also can be quite difficult to navigate. But and I appreciate that we return to the local decision making, and I understand how important that is. But our young people have to access school, they have to access college, and is there something different that really isn't about local choice and much more about ensuring that all our young people can get to where they need to go?
I think, again, a one-size-fits-all isn't necessarily the best approach here. I think, the different demographics in different areas may dictate the priorities, of the decisions in that area. They can already go above and beyond in those local areas. As I said, you've got commercial operators already in 73 out of the 85 areas are already doing youth. And I take your point, that can vary from provider to provider. That's assuming that was a commercial operator decision to offer that fare. Obviously, if it's a local transport authority using their bus grant, that would be a more across-the-board fare.
Do you think more could be done in terms of the guidance that the department gives enabling local transport authorities to make those decisions, but with greater direction from the department?
Yeah, without obviously wanting to stifle that local decision making, I think the guidance is important. So those considerations are made, and perhaps see more communication on what the art of the possible is with the funding. People recognise the opportunities that they have to use that funding.
And if I can add, that's one of the things I think we will pick up through the Enhanced Partnership Review work we're doing in terms of what sort of interventions have gone into place, where people have put youth fares in place, and there are some good examples, I think, around a sort of £1.50, £1 fares. I think the North East, for example, has got a £1 flat fare for, I think it's under 19s, or it might be under 21, I think, actually, or a £3 all-day multimodal, which is exactly because they believe that's really important for accessing employment, and that's including from the more rural areas into those places where there's employment or training or opportunity. So we want to bring some of that learning out, and as you suggest, I think really share what we've seen and the seen working from one authority to another, so they can make a much more informed choice.
Scott.
Yes, so this is a really interesting area. Going back to Catherine's point about concessionary travel for younger people. That in Scotland under 22s travel for free. It's not come without its problems, but there's massive benefits to that. And we do have free travel in England for what you called elderly people.
I have to declare an interest. I get mine today.
Yeah. So officially elderly, I guess.
Yeah.
but
Brave.
Okay. I shouldn't do that to Chair, should I? But in answer to Catherine's question, you said to expand concessionary travel to younger people, that would have to come from within that budget. But there's other decisions we could make. Bus travel, particularly for younger people, you're going to benefit people who are on lower incomes. But something like the decision to continue to freeze fuel duty levels, that by and large benefit people who are wealthier. So is that not a source of income that you can use rather than benefiting people, the wealthier people who tend to own cars? That money could have been used to create more access to bus travel, perhaps people on lower incomes, perhaps to younger people. Does that not meet the aims of this government, to create that fair society?
Right, I hear what you're saying. It's a matter for the Treasury, and I'll leave that.
It's always a matter. Can I go back to your answer to Catherine's point about young people getting to college or first jobs or whatever, and they're apart from the very elderly who should not be driving if they have health considerations, but the young people are far less likely to have access to a car. And you say horses for courses, different areas, but the reality is wherever you are in England, there's a need to get to school, college, or to work first thing in the morning and come back, late afternoon, early evening. That doesn't change. And then for many other services to get to services in the middle of the day or to get back home from them. Now, in Ireland, they have a minimum service for all communities of 3 return services a day minimum. And many other countries have a similar minimum service. What's stopping that happening in England, outside of London?
I think it goes back to that the whatever system is put in place, if you were to extend the NTS, it needs to be financially sustainable, fundamentally, at the end of the day.
It's not a government priority, then?
I'm not saying it's not a government priority, but obviously there's various demands on the public purse, and I think we're already, as I said, providing that funding through the bus grant, so that local areas are able to use that in order to achieve the same outcome.
Okay, did you?
If we've got time,
Yeah, go on. Yeah.
part of the challenge, let's face it, is that the bus services through fare revenue are unlikely ever to become sustainable. So whether in London or in rural areas, the price of running the service in Ireland is very, very high. The difference it makes, though, isn't to the public purse, it's to the private purse when a household in a rural area with 2 people working can go from 2 cars to 1. But the scale of the investment needed to get there is very significant. It won't be built up through increment. You won't see that return on the household purse until the network is of sufficient scale and standard to actually solve for that use case of dependable, reliable school, work, etc. transport. So I think I just re-ask the chair's question, but with that framing in mind, that's clearly not the way that the Treasury is seeing the investment opportunity here, is it? We're not looking to be able to spend enough money to get to that level to actually take cars off the road in rural areas.
Sorry, and the other added benefit that we learnt in Ireland is the regeneration of country towns. Because many more people were coming into town and therefore spending money, people who don't have access to a car. So they were seeing that rural growth and regeneration. So those 2 points, I think
I disagree in terms of, I think there can be incremental improvements made by the investments and the empowerment of local leaders to shape their bus services around their communities. I think that is possible. I think you've obviously seen in Manchester, Greater Manchester, just to correct the point there, some fantastic results of the work that the Mayor of Greater Manchester has seen there. I'm very conscious of saying Greater Manchester because I get told off by various members. So I disagree. I think you can see
improvements.
Those improvements.
It's not going to take cars off drives in rural areas.
Well, I think it's about building trust again. You see the improvements, you build trust, similar to what they did in Jersey. They improved trust because they worked together on that franchising arrangement. Taking advantage of that commercial skill and knowledge there as well. And we've seen, people are 56. I'll correct the figure if that's the wrong number. It's similar to that. 56% of people who have cars are now choosing to use the bus. So you can see incremental improvements. We can see through the measures that we're undertaking, through funding and empowering local leaders, improvements in buses throughout the country. But it will take time. But it will take time to rebuild trust as well.
I ask if Stephen has any comments on it.
Okay.
Chair, may I ask if Stephen has any comments on this?
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, sure.
Of course, yes.
And I think the bit of context I would add is just if you step back and look at the scale of government funding, and this is for context rather than overall scale, it is now about 3 times the level it was before the pandemic. And that's like DFT funding for buses. So that, whilst it may or may not be the scale everybody would like to see, it's probably just worth for context. It is significantly higher than it was in say, 2018-19.
Okay, thank you. Alex.
Thank you, Chair. We've kind of moved into a brave new world of buses, and the skills that are needed within local transport authorities have very much changed. So moving away from officers who were kind of used to coming up with sticking plaster solutions for propping up unviable services to, where we need to do contract negotiation, financial modelling, performance monitoring, etc. Are you satisfied that all local transport authorities have got that capacity so they'll be able to fully participate in this brave new world?
No, which is why we're obviously putting that investment in all local transport authorities outside of England to support in terms of their capability and capacity. I think you would have heard us say before, we think that would provide at least sufficient funding to employ at least one additional bus officer. And we're working with local transport authorities to understand what extra help is needed and building upon the support that we already provide. We're working with the Chartered Institute for Highways and Transportation in terms of who host our Bus Centre of Excellence, which is a fantastic resource, really proud of that, in order to create that support package for LTAs. We're also working with the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport on a new qualification training package for bus professionals, and we're funding 100 places. I think there's something like 86 have been taken up so far. when you consider there's 76 enhanced partnerships. I think that's a great take up there. And obviously support in terms of franchising, in terms of the pilots that we're doing, so we can increase the guidance in terms of the model so that people can identify the best model that's appropriate to their area. And I think the Bus Centre of Excellence also has a franchising network group.
Yeah.
So people are coming together, they're having those discussions as well. And on top of that, we're building that toolkit, if you like, the toolkit as well, in terms of helping local authorities choose the best model.
Do you think this one extra member of staff is enough? Is that a floor or a ceiling of the department's ambition?
That's the foundation. It's the foundation. Look, I think we want to do even more, obviously. We want to empower and support local authorities to make these transitions, these decisions. They can obviously, with that funding, they can choose to employ more, depending on their circumstances and dependent upon the model at which they choose. Because I go back to the Jersey model again. They did that with a very small number of officers and then capitalised on the skills and experience of the private operator to supplement that. So absolutely not the ceiling, if you like, very much the foundation.
Okay, Lawrence.
Thank you, Chair. It's a related question about capacity in the context of the lifting of the ban on the creation of new municipal bus companies. We've already heard from other witnesses that internal capacity within local authorities is one of the barriers that they face to creating new municipals. And as you know, although existing municipals are often very high performers, they, with some limited exceptions, they are not new creations post a deregulation era. I know that in the House of Lords, the department said that new guidance will be provided. Is the door open to providing additional support if local authorities are able to produce a strong business case for creating a new municipal bus company, but in practice they're finding there are resourcing challenges to getting it off the ground?
I think there'll be rare occurrences where someone is wanting to establish a local authority operated bus company from scratch. I think you're assuming, I guess, a whole service provided by the local authority. It may be that they create this in terms of an operator of last resort, for instance, if they're unable to attract sufficient interest in a franchise, for example. But when local transport authorities are considering which model to adopt, obviously the affordability of that will be a key consideration.
In that kind of scenario, the current law potentially can be worked around because an authority can acquire, say, a failed private operator for a nominal price, and that wouldn't be barred by the existing legislation. There's obviously a symbolic change with the new legislation, but it sounds like the main benefit of the legislation might actually be more for existing municipal operators because of the lifting of the current financial restrictions upon them.
I think it adds another element to the toolkit there. Again, going back to the potential for a kind of operator of last resort. It may be that current people are exploring franchising in the end decide that they want to operate some of those bus services themselves, or certain sections of those bus services themselves.
And the other thing I'd just add is it doesn't necessarily have to be a traditional large-scale normal bus company. So even in the Rural Mobility Fund, we are seeing some examples of local authorities actually doing the demand responsive in-house, and there's perhaps a bit of ambiguity there around whether that's fine. So actually you could imagine a small bus company being set up in the first instance to run DRT and then potentially growing out of that. So I wouldn't necessarily think about it as big bang. Or you could also think about it in terms of actually having proper competition for socially necessary services with perhaps a small number of vehicles in the first instance, operating out of one location. So I wouldn't necessarily start from your existing municipal as necessarily being the model, or local authority bus company being the model. But I think, again, a bit like the franchising options, you could move into it on a more incremental basis, and actually making this legislative change would allow that to happen in a way that if we hadn't done it, you perhaps wouldn't be able to.
So interesting.
Okay, all right. Katie.
Thank you, Chair. I sent out a transport survey to every home in the Wirral of Kent in my constituency, and on that I asked about buses, and a third of people who use buses do so as part of a longer journey, and one of the top requests that people had was to match them up better with train times. Now, I appreciate that isn't always perfectly possible because there are quite literally several moving parts, but as the department thinks about the integrated national transport survey, what specific steps are you taking to kind of marry up different forms of transport and the role that buses play in that, particularly in rural areas where they can help do that kind of final mile to get people to the train station?
Yeah, sure. I think integration is key. I think that not only with different modes of public transport, but also crucially with active travel as well. I mean, no one tends to get the bus without having walked, wheeled or cycled the first bit, the first instance, so that's an important aspect there. Our local authorities are encouraged, obviously, when they're considering their BSIPs, to consider this kind of integration, if you like, with other modes, and I think that could become easier, I think, potentially under Great British Railways. You know, you've got that great oversight over the railways, and elected mayors in local areas will have a statutory input into Great British Railways as well. We're taking quite a lot of action in terms of more integrated ticketing. We're working with, I think it's the West Midlands, West Midlands and Midlands Connect at a national technology solution for integrated ticketing. I'm not sure the timescales for that. Are we looking at the?
It's out to procurement at the moment, led by West Midlands Command Authority.
And obviously, as you mentioned, we're developing that integrated national transport strategy to really set the long-term vision for transport. I don't know why there wasn't one before. I think it's important in terms of how transport's designed, how it is built and operated, with passengers right at the centre again, and that's been developed to open dialogue, if you like, through collaboration, in a public kind of call for input. I think it's like 6,000 contributions made by members of the public and stakeholders into that, as well as 11 regional roadshows. I think that shows there's a great degree of public interest in the points that you've just made. It's really important to people. I think obviously the exact scope of the strategy is still being kind of finalised and will be obviously informed by those outputs that I've talked about. But I think it will be fundamental, I think, in terms of achieving the government's missions, in terms of economic growth, in terms of enabling access to jobs, to education, and I guess the efficient movement of goods and services as well.
Okay. Rebecca, you wanted to come in?
Very tiny supplementary on this, but I think just to follow up from what Katie has said, just to flag with you the need for passenger ferries as well. So we've got a classic example in my constituency where the bus arrives a few minutes after the ferry departs into the city, which then obviously means people who want to use that join it, whether that's on foot or with their bus or car, can't. So just to flag boats as well would be great.
I think it's really important that we're able to facilitate better multimodal transport solutions, and I think this will go some way.
Passenger ferries get forgotten somewhere.
Yeah, don't get me wrong, this is not a simple ask, I think, as you know, there's lots of moving parts.
County dividing as well. Devon and Cornwall, there's a great one, but you have to get the bus there, and if they don't marry up, it's pointless. So.
Very good point, thank you. Elsie.
Thanks, Chair. Across Greater Manchester, devolution has demonstrated that running a bus service is obviously more than just about profit. As you were saying earlier, it's about getting passengers from A to B. Ideally, I think with no financial penalty for switching modes. How will your ambitions for integration overcome the fragmentation of funding and governance across different transport modes? Is devolution a silver bullet in other areas outside of Greater Manchester?
No, I don't think it's necessarily a silver bullet, but I think devolution is a really exciting opportunity, and we've seen fantastic progress in places like Greater Manchester, who obviously franchised their network already. And again, I think the bus bill gives areas more power to improve their bus services, including in new options like creating their own bus grants, for instance.
What steps is the department taking to improve the cross-boundary coordination of bus services, particularly across neighbouring areas where a variety of franchising and enhanced partnership models might apply?
So we're giving, obviously, more powers to local leaders within the bus service bill. We expect them to work together with each other to think creatively with nearby authorities. I think that's going to be really important when they redesign their networks to meet local needs. So, for example, the bill will let franchising authorities give permits to operators who want to run non-franchise services within a franchised area. Franchise authorities will need to consider the benefits of cross-boundary services in all the areas that they serve, not just within the franchised area. And I think this will help franchising authorities to better use what the market can offer. Obviously, you've got services coming into the franchised area, which can be, you don't need to do as much in your franchised area, if you know what I mean. We've updated our guidance to LTAs that makes clear that they should consider cross-boundary services during the franchising assessment. And going back to an earlier point where we talked about the government's devolution plans and the move towards strategic authorities, obviously, a consequence of that will mean less boundaries. But that, notwithstanding the fact there's an expectation here and within guidance there that careful consideration is made, not just within your boundaries, but the impact and opportunities of working with areas outside of your franchised area can bring.
Yeah, and just finally for me, what do you expect will happen to bus service provision in these areas if more flexibility isn't given to operators outside of franchised areas to run services into them?
I think we need to recognise, and local transport authorities need to recognise, that people don't exist in a bubble. They may live in one area, work in another, and so it's in everybody's interest that we work together collaboratively to break down any barriers when it comes to cross-boundary work.
Thank you. Right, let's move on to demand responsive transport.
Yes, I know, and we've heard from various people that the department is currently sort of evaluating demand responsive transport. What role do you think it could and should play in the national bus network?
I think, alternative service models are really important. Ensuring that communities have access to transport where traditional services may not be working or viable. I think both DRT, design responsive transport, and crucially, and I think it's important to emphasise this, community transport. I'm a big fan of community transport. Can fill the gaps where your traditional services would otherwise not be available. Getting people again to education, to jobs, etc. That could include not just going direct to location, but to transport hubs. So DRT getting people to a transport hub to then be able to take the bus or other means as well. And that could often, in some cases, be a cheaper alternative and a more productive and efficient service for local people. And we encourage all local transport authorities to consider community transport and DRT as part of their bus service improvement plans. And how these services can better connect and add to their wider transport network.
And we've heard that demand responsive transport can be difficult to scale. I also, in the survey that I mentioned earlier, so we have demand responsive transport in Kent. It's called Kent Carrier, but only 1 in 5 people had even heard of it. So as you're thinking about rolling it out, both the scaling piece and the related, I suppose, kind of marketing and comms piece, how are you thinking about both of those?
So we're creating best practice guidance, obviously, as a result of the trials that we've been undertaking under the Rural Mobility Fund. And that's based on the insights from the trials, but also from experienced local transport authorities who've been successful in creating effective DRT solutions. And that first piece of guidance should be later this year on the back of the outcomes of the evaluation. And we're also ensuring that this is addressed, as well as in your kind of enhanced partnership models, also addressed through franchising pilots as well. As we mentioned earlier on, some forms of franchising will be a fantastic mechanism to incorporate design responsive transport.
Okay, thank you. Rebecca.
So just on the design responsive transport a bit further, witnesses have told us that DRT services can face financial disadvantages when compared to fixed route buses when operating with private hire vehicles which are subject to VAT. So we're just asking, will the department engage with the Treasury to consider whether VAT rules could be reviewed to ensure a level playing field for DRT services?
Yeah, sure. Look, I recognise that there is some significant concerns within the sector. We've obviously shared that information from DRT providers with our colleagues in the Treasury. Ultimately, obviously, VAT policy is a matter for the Treasury, but we have made sure that those representations have got to where they need to go.
Let me do the next one. So moving on to community transport, which I suppose links up to DRT as well. We've heard calls from the community transport sector for a more flexible and simplified regulatory framework. So we're wondering, have you considered reforming Section 19 and Section 22 permits to support this?
I know it's complicated. It is complicated, and I can see a case where we would review this. However, what we'd need to be very, very careful of is understanding the unintended consequences. Safety should always be paramount in any decision. It's complicated already. There's a potential for unpicking that and making it even more complicated. But I don't think it'd be worth you just talking about some of the exemptions that exist so people get an idea of the current complexity.
Yeah, very happy to. I mean, I think when it was originally brought in, it was designed to be a fairly straightforward system in that if you're running a community bus service, you'd run it under Section 22. It would be less onerous than running a public service vehicle. And if you were something like a school minibus or a club or whatever, you'd be under Section 19. The reality of life has got far more blurred than that. The case law, other things have come in over the years. And the whole permit regime is kind of governed by those three exemptions about being non-commercial, or having a main occupation that's not road transport, or being short distance, which is generally 10 miles, but it can be longer in a more rural context where that's justified by the circumstances. And I think my view would be, as the Minister says, we must keep this under review, we must keep looking at it carefully, but there's some quite significant risk in here around the case law, and although it's complex, generally it's working in some way, shape or form under the current regime, even if it's a bit tricky. My worry would be if we move to an entirely new regime, you then start creating entirely new sets of case law, and it might actually, in the short term, have some unintended consequences on the system. So we need to balance and trade that off in our thinking. I'd be slightly nervous that a change to the legislative framework would necessarily solve all the problems. Actually, you may end up with a worse outcome if you're not really careful, or if you're a bit unlucky. So I think we've got to balance off.
Okay, sorry, we moved on quite quickly on DRT. Did you want to come in on anything else?
Sorry. No, that's okay, that's fine. Yeah, just very quickly, Chair. I'd just be interested to understand if the Minister thinks, why should any travel be subject to VAT? I'm thinking particularly of my constituency, where obviously Greater Manchester has done great things when it comes to bus franchising, but there are still huge, gaps sometimes in the transport network locally. When private hire vehicles, for example, if they were subject to VAT, this might get passed on in terms of wages to drivers and things like that, and maybe put them at a disadvantage. So yeah, I'd like to understand really, travel isn't a luxury, especially not in my constituency. Why would it be subject to VAT?
I'm afraid my colleague's going to be disappointed in my answer. Referring you back to this is really a matter for the Treasury, and obviously we've passed on the concerns of the sector to the Treasury to make sure they take that under advisement. But VAT policy is obviously a matter for my colleagues in the Treasury.
Treasury questions is coming up, I think.
There you go.
Lawrence, you wanted to pick up something.
It's just a very quick follow-up on something, Stephen, that you said in respect of demand-responsive transport, particularly in the context of school minibuses. The NSUWT Teachers Union and some of the support staff unions currently advise their members not to drive school minibuses because of some of the ambiguities that they see under Section 19 process. I just wanted to ask whether that's an issue that's on your radar and whether there are cross-departmental conversations with the Department for Education on that matter.
Yeah, it's absolutely on our radar, and we're regularly talking to our colleagues who look after school transport and wider issues.
It comes back to actually any change you want to ensure that safety is of paramount importance, and you understand any unintended consequences. For instance, I'm not saying this would happen, but if there was a reduction in the people capable of driving these buses, what's the consequences on schools' ability to get their children to enjoy these school trips and outings, etc. as well. So I think it's important that we do continue to work with DFE, etc. to understand that. But I'm aware of the calls from both the trade union and members to look at this issue.
Okay, thank you. Right, Laura, no, you've got another question, I think, on Lawrence, on community transport.
So I've got a question, I think, on licences.
23, yeah. Well, question 23.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry. So,
okay.
And I draw attention here to donations my constituency parties have from the GMB trade union, because in some areas do represent bus drivers. We've been told in evidence that there are significant issues for driver recruitment across the community transport sector. So what scope is there, I think this maybe builds on your recent comments, to review the current D1 licence requirements?
There was actually, under the previous government, a call for evidence, I think it was back in 2022, 2023? 23, on driving licensing, including D1. The feedback that we got from it, whilst there was support for looking at D1, there wasn't sufficient evidence to suggest it would improve the driver recruitment, and not enough evidence to suggest that it wouldn't be introducing extra risk when it comes to safety. And absolutely we don't want to see road safety compromised in any way. When you look at those that are taking those D1 tests now, so between September, from January to September 2024, 1 in 5 people that took the D1 test failed. Now, if there wasn't a test in place, those very people would be driving minibuses, and that would introduce additional risk into the system. So I think we, again, always keen to continually evaluate these, because I want DRT, I want community transport to be successful, but what we can't accept is a degradation in road safety, which will be the fundamental driving force behind any future changes.
And specifically, are you considering, or have you considered, granting D1 entitlement to new Category B licence holders to help increase that pool of drivers?
I think it goes back to that evidence base in terms of at the moment, we're looking at those tests. I think if 1 in 5 are failing that, I think that risk is something that we couldn't tolerate.
Okay, Scott, you wanted to come in now.
Yes, thank you. Just to broaden the debate out a little bit, Simon, I think a lot of people are hopeful that what the franchising process is going to end up with is better services, better buses actually on routes, and we're lucky in the UK. We've got fantastic bus manufacturers who are making great electric buses, and next week Wright buses coming along with our hydrogen bus, which is super exciting. But the Better Buses Bill gives the Secretary of State the power to stop bus companies registering new diesel buses, but there's no date for that yet. So what's your thinking around the date for that?
I think we've been really clear that will be not before 2030, because again, I think it's obviously we've got really big ambitions when it comes to decarbonising our public transport. We want to do that with the industry. What I don't want to do is to put undue pressure on that, and there's a lot of diesel buses out there at the moment.
This is about registering new buses, though, and the manufacturers in the UK probably welcome certainty around the date.
Exactly. We'll be looking at that, obviously. And again, I visited Wright Bus myself not so long ago. They do some great work, and do some great work in terms of the repowering market as well, which I think is a really exciting innovation, where they're transforming those old diesel buses, giving them another decade of life by converting them into electric buses. But again, we're having those conversations now. We'll be working with industry and stakeholders to settle that date and give industry, local transport authorities the notice that they need and the pathway that they need to achieve that. I hosted the first bus manufacturer expert panel a couple of months ago, and that's around having some of these discussions, getting the manufacturers around the table, the operators, local transport authorities, and various stakeholders around the table, both in terms of that aspiration on decarbonisation, what we can further do to push that forward, but also how do we create that smooth pipeline of orders to continue to support manufacturers who create fantastic products that we're proud of and want to see introduced in this country, but also have a strong export market as well as world leaders.
For bus companies though, and those manufacturers, 2030 is just the day after tomorrow. So
before 2030.
Yeah, it's right, not before 2030. So when do you think you'll be able to make a decision on that? You're saying you're thinking about a decision, so when do you think you'll be able to make that decision?
As I said, we're having these discussions and we'll be engaging with the sector when we come to a decision on that.
Thank you.
Steph, you had
Thank you. Yes, given I think what we've heard so far about the role of the government policy, the autonomy you're seeking to pass, but also ambition onto local LTAs and leadership, I'm interested in the bit that's in the middle, which is the department itself. What sort of role, Stephen, you see the department's team that you look after having? What sorts of resources you might be offering LTAs? For instance, would you be in a position to offer them support on or guidance on the operating model once they've set their objectives?
Yeah, sure. And I think first thing I'd say is there's been really quite a big change in the way in which my team works since the election. Really clear steer from the ministerial team that where they want us to be is in a position not of sort of marking local authorities' homework in terms of what they're doing, which was perhaps an oversimplification, but the sort of tone of where we were for the last government. We were approving all the bus service improvement plans, and that meant we didn't necessarily have the space, the time, the capacity to do as much on the support side of things as we would have liked to. So the focus now is very much about us being a team that enables the authorities and helps them succeed. And I think we're trying to do that very much in partnership with organisations such as the Bus Centre of Excellence that we fund, but it's absolutely way out. So we're doing a bit of work at the moment, as the Minister mentioned, on a toolkit which is exactly designed to help authorities take the choice between, is it enhanced partnership for me, is it franchising one of the models, is it things like actually what circumstances would a local authority bus company be the right thing for us. So that's the kind of space we are trying to operate in. I think it's not necessarily about the department doing it all, but it's in part about making sure the department's working with our partners, whether that's CIHT and the Bus Centre of Excellence, whether that's organisations like Transport Focus, to make sure the right kind of support's there. Local authorities know that's there. But if you take the franchising pilots and that kind of work, that's absolutely about us sort of rolling our sleeves up, getting alongside local authorities and doing things together in a real sort of partnership rather than telling anybody what to do, but actually making sure we're properly learning. And I think, for me, the most important thing that my team and I need to keep doing is going out and about, talking to all the different authorities, making sure we understand those differences of approaches and what it's like on the front line doing this work in a rural authority or elsewhere.
I don't want to speak on behalf of the Chair, but I'm sure the committee would be interested in hearing the results of those pilots as soon as they become available.
You speak on behalf of all the committee.
Thank you.
Alex, did you have something you wanted to pick up from earlier?
So we talked earlier about the fact that BSIP was about finding new services and that the bill was particularly about protecting socially necessary services. And the onus seems to be very much on the local authorities to decide. Is there not a danger that by putting the emphasis in the bill and new law and legislation, that actually it's incentivising local authorities merely to think about the socially necessary services and perhaps not think about enhancements across the wider network that could potentially benefit more people and perhaps in fact might become commercially viable by putting in the subsidy? Is there not a danger that by having a long list of socially necessary services, you just work your way down that and don't think about that other part of having a successful network?
I think I hear what you're saying, but I think it's in the interest of local transport authorities, local authorities generally. They want to see successful bus services. That equals, social connectivity. That equals economic growth in the area. That equals young people being able to get to education and people be able to access good, well-paid jobs. So I think the incentives are plain to see already. I think our job is then, as I said, a few times now, is about giving them the powers, the skills, and support and the funding to be able to achieve that.
Talking of which, I think in terms of how local areas are able to spend the discretion they have in spending their bus grant.
Yep.
We've heard that they could spend it on concessionary travel, say for young people. We've heard they could spend it on buses to not spots.
Yep.
But they can't they're not going to be able to do all of that, are they? So is it, are we going to end up with a system where one local authority will provide free travel for young people, and the next door authority will not provide concessionary travel, but will support a daily bus service to a particular village? And we're going to get this inconsistency. There doesn't seem to be an overall vision that we want to ensure that young people can get free travel, and that we fill not spots. Do you understand that the consequences of this level of discretion on such important areas?
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. I think our vision's really clear, and I think really clearly articulated both in the bill and other things in terms of achieving those affordable, reliable bus services, connecting people, passengers feeling safe, information empowering. But it could either be Westminster and Whitehall making those decisions, or, in my view, local areas deciding how to spend that money to best benefit their local area.
That's absolutely true, although, as we saw in Ireland, we had a national minimum service, and that's still possible from Westminster. It's possible that people in England, wherever they live, should be able to expect a basic bus service at a particular cost ceiling or something like that. But it's what other countries
sure.
Okay, I think if no one else has any other burning questions, Baggy for the last two.
Thank you. So we've heard about enhanced partnerships and the wide benefit that they offer, but we also know workers working with employers, working with local authorities and service users is really, really important and effective. So can we get trade unions to be joining the EP forums?
I don't know what's the actual guidance on who. Is it quite flexible in terms of the membership?
I don't think there's sort of any formal rules one way or the other. So the EP itself is ultimately a statutory document between authority and operators, but the sort of the governance involvement around it has got a lot of mixed models, so it's certainly something we can look at. And it's probably worth saying that sort of we meet really regularly with the trade unions around the changes we're making through the bill, and more widely to try and make sure that we absolutely have that employee perspective fed into the work we're doing.
I think it goes back to the kind of review of enhanced partnerships and looking at, I guess we can look at the memberships and how does that, what does that contribute? Is it some, I keep doing that. It's just good examples where there is trade union involvement and really set out the benefits of that.
Okay, thank you. And then finally, and I think you'll like this one, delivering better bus service.
You had me at finally.
Delivering better bus services will ensure people have proper access to jobs and opportunities, putting more money in their pockets and powering growth in every corner of the country. So with that in mind, Minister, what changes do we expect to see in buses between now and the end of this Parliament?
Yes, I go back to the beginning where I talked about our vision, where we talked about those more reliable, more affordable, faster, better integrated transport that's safer, both at all aspects of the journey, and that people have access to that information to empower them to make decisions. Look, I'm not going to pretend by the end of this Parliament we have fixed everything, but what I'm convinced about is that we will have seen progress by giving those local areas the powers that they need to make those long-lasting improvements, going back to the multi-year funding, etc. We'd have seen the bus service bill become law, I hope, and already delivering what I think will be one of the biggest reforms to buses in over 40 years, and all the benefits that come with that. I would have expected many more areas to either adopted or be exploring franchising, and we'll have taken action to provide that long-term funding that I talked about. And greater transparency, going back to the data, greater transparency for the public over the performance of their bus networks. But fundamentally, going back to that one word at the beginning, we would have begun to rebuild trust. Trust that buses are going to get people to where they want to get to, they're going to be on time, they're going to be frequent, they're going to be affordable. So rebuilding trust, I hope. By the end of the Parliament, we're beginning to see that happen.
think more specifically for all of the committee members' constituents, but not mine, will people living in England actually, in 4 years and 2 months' time, see more buses to more places in 4 years and 2 months' time?
That's certainly our intention, and that we're doing everything possible to make that happen.
We all hope so. Thank you very much, and that brings us to the end of this session. I'd like to thank you very much for your evidence today, and also, as we always say, if there's anything you want to add, please do send us in writing. It's also the last session of this inquiry. We found this session really valuable. We look forward to considering our recommendations to you on this topic, and in due course, your response to our recommendations. That concludes today's meeting. Order.